Hi there, and welcome. I'm so glad you're here. Tonight, I have a story for you. One filled with ancient houses, whispered secrets, and a game that shaped the fate of a kingdom. We'll begin in the icy north, where a single visit would set an entire world into motion. From Winterfell to King's Landing, from fire to snow, the tale we'll follow is rich with history and threaded with betrayal, love, and quiet moments of courage. So, if you're ready, find a cozy spot, let your shoulders soften, and allow your breath to slow. There's no need to stay awake. Just let the story carry you gently to sleep. Let's begin the timeline of Westeros, the story of the Game of Thrones. One lie can shatter a kingdom. One illegitimate child can bring down a throne. When King Robert Baratheon arrived at Winterfell, he unknowingly brought death with him. The King of the Seven Kingdoms came north to ask his oldest friend, Ned Stark, to serve as his hand. It seemed like a noble request. In truth, it was a death sentence. The story begins in blood and snow, and with a secret that would unravel everything. A few weeks before the royal visit, Ned's young son Bran was climbing Winterfell's walls, as he had done countless times before. He loved the view from high above, but that morning he climbed too far and witnessed something he was never meant to see. Queen Cersei and her twin brother Jaime, together in a way no brother and sister should ever be. Jaime looked into Bran's innocent eyes and made a decision that would change everything. He pushed the boy out of the tower window. Bran should have died. Instead, he survived the fall but was left paralyzed. Worse than his broken body was what followed. While Bran lay unconscious, someone tried to make sure he never woke up. An assassin crept into his room, armed with a Valyrian steel dagger. He was stopped by Bran's direwolf, who attacked the killer with the fury only a creature protecting its own could show. Catelyn Stark fought alongside the wolf until the guards arrived, saving her son's life. That Valyrian dagger would prove to be more than just a weapon. It was the first clue to something far greater and far more dangerous. From the beginning, the direwolves were a sign. The Stark children had found 6 pups in the snow beside their dead mother. One for each of Ned Stark's children, and even one for Jon Snow, the illegitimate son who never truly belonged. The wolves grew quickly and formed deep bonds with their masters, almost as if touched by magic. They would prove to be far more important than anyone imagined, especially as darkness began creeping back into the world. Not long before all of this, the former hand of the king, Jon Arryn, had died suddenly and suspiciously. Jon Arryn had uncovered something that powerful people were willing to kill to keep secret. Something about the royal children themselves. A truth that could shake the foundations of the realm. Ned Stark, a man of principle and honor, believed in duty above all else. So when Robert asked him to be hand, Ned accepted. Because that's what an honorable man does. But his wife, Catelyn, feared the South. She had a mother's instinct that told her danger awaited in King's Landing, a place where men played the deadly Game of Thrones and good men rarely lasted long. When Robert came to Winterfell, he didn't come alone. He brought his entire court, his wife, Queen Cersei, whose cold green eyes missed nothing, Prince Joffrey, golden-haired and angel-faced but with a dark heart, Princess Myrcella and Prince Tommen, still too young to understand their family's poison, and Tyrion Lannister, the Queen's dwarf brother, clever, sharp-tongued, and underestimated by everyone. But the most dangerous person in Robert's party wasn't wearing a crown. Peter Baelish, Littlefinger, had grown up at Riverrun, once in love with Catelyn Stark. She chose Ned instead. Now Littlefinger served as master of coin in the capital. He smiled, schemed, and remembered every slight. Behind his charm was a web of favors, secrets, and manipulation that reached across the realm. He was patient, he was calculating, and he would do anything to get what he wanted. The journey south changed everything for the Stark family. In King's Landing, Arya Stark began her training in water dancing with her swordmaster. But trouble started when Prince Joffrey found Arya's friend, the butcher's boy. Joffrey, cruel and arrogant, drew his sword on the child and would have hurt him badly if Arya hadn't stepped in. Her direwolf, Nymeria, bit the prince to protect her. Joffrey screamed and cried, not out of pain, but humiliation. When questioned by the king, he lied, claimed Arya and the butcher's boy attacked him unprovoked. Queen Cersei demanded punishment, blood for blood. Nymeria couldn't be found. Arya had driven her away with stones to keep her safe. But politics needed a victim. So King Robert ordered Ned to execute Sansa's direwolf, Lady, instead. The wolf had done nothing wrong. Sansa, still dreaming of fairy tale romance, watched her father kill her innocent wolf because her future husband's mother demanded it. That was the day she began to understand the cost of power. Not gold, not glory, but blood, innocence, and the death of everything good. Meanwhile, Ned began to uncover the real reason Jon Arryn had died. Arryn had been digging into the truth, speaking with blacksmiths and servants, reading books on inheritance and bloodlines. He had discovered a detail hiding in plain sight. Every true-born Baratheon for centuries had dark hair and strong builds. But Robert's children, blonde, fragile-looking, they looked nothing like their supposed father. Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen weren't Robert's heirs. They were the children of Jaime and Cersei Lannister, a truth that could destroy the realm. Ned Stark, ever honorable, believed in truth above all. He gave Cersei a chance to flee with her children before revealing what he knew to Robert. She refused. She said she'd burn the kingdom to protect her children. A lioness, fierce and dangerous. But Robert would never hear her confession. Robert Baratheon, the warrior king who took the throne by force, still found joy in the hunt. He loved wild boar and strong wine, especially together. On one such hunt, Cersei ensured her cousin Lancel filled Robert's cup again and again. The king went into the forest drunk, unsteady, and vulnerable. he didn't stand a chance. The boar's tusks tore him open. Robert bled for days, and on his deathbed, he named Ned as regent to rule until Joffrey came of age. Robert trusted his old friend to protect his son and keep the realm stable. But Ned knew the truth. Joffrey wasn't Robert's son. So he altered the king's final decree. Instead of naming Joffrey, he wrote that Robert's rightful heir would inherit, meaning Stannis Baratheon, Robert's hard, humorless younger brother, a man Ned believed was legitimate, even if not loved. Ned planned to reveal the truth, but truth in King's Landing is more dangerous than lies. Littlefinger, always smiling, promised Ned the support of the City Watch. He said the gold cloaks would back Ned when the time came. He lied. When Ned moved to arrest Cersei and the children in the throne room, the gold cloaks turned on him. Swords were drawn. Littlefinger pressed a dagger to Ned's throat and whispered the only honest words he ever said. "I did warn you not to trust me." Joffrey took the throne and immediately had Ned arrested for treason. Everyone expected mercy. Even Cersei urged restraint. But Joffrey, impulsive and cruel, wanted blood. He ordered Ned Stark's execution, and he forced Sansa to watch. Arya saw it happen from the crowd, but before she could act, Yoren of the Night's Watch pulled her away. Hidden and helpless, she watched her father die. Ned gave a false confession, hoping it would spare his daughters. Instead, Ice, the Stark family sword, took his head. The blade that had served House Stark for generations ended the life of its last true lord. And with that, the war truly began. The moment Ned Stark was executed, the North rose in rebellion. Robb Stark, just 19, had already called his banners when news of his father's imprisonment reached him. But when word came of Ned's death, everything changed. The Northern Lords bent the knee, not to the Iron Throne, but to Robb. They declared him king in the North, the first since before Aegon's conquest. The South had murdered their liege lord. They would kneel no longer. Robb proved he had inherited more than just his father's name. In battle, he was cunning, swift, and fearless. He moved his army faster than anyone expected and ambushed the Lannisters at the Whispering Wood. There, he captured Jaime Lannister, the famed Kingslayer, the best swordsman in the realm, and threw him in chains. The boy king, untested in war, had captured the realm's greatest warrior. But Robb wasn't the only one laying claim to the throne. Robert Baratheon's younger brothers both believed the crown should be theirs. Stannis, the elder of the two, was cold, stern, and rigid. For years, he'd watched Robert rule with excess, while he himself bore the burden of duty. Now that Robert was gone, Stannis declared himself king, by law, by birth, and by the gods. Renly, the youngest Baratheon, had a different approach. He was charming, likable, and had powerful allies, especially the wealthy House Tyrell. He claimed the crown because the people loved him, and in Westeros, sometimes that matters more than legitimacy. Instead of uniting, the brothers divided their strength, and they would pay dearly for it. Elsewhere, Balon Greyjoy of the Iron Islands saw his chance. Years ago, Robert had crushed his rebellion, but now, with the realm distracted, Balon crowned himself king of the Iron Islands once again. He planned to strike the north while Robb fought the Lannisters in the south. But far across the sea, yet another contender began to rise, one born of fire and blood. Across the narrow sea, Daenerys Targaryen had once been nothing more than a pawn, sold by her brother Viserys to the Dothraki in exchange for a promise of an army. Viserys dreamed of reclaiming the Iron Throne with fire and blood, but he never realized that the true dragon in their family wasn't him. Dany began her story as a frightened girl married off to a warlord who didn't speak her language. Khal Drogo took her like property, but over time, she learned, she grew, and eventually, she became someone the Dothraki followed not just out of tradition, but loyalty. She was given 3 ancient dragon eggs as a wedding gift. Fossils, people believed, relics from a time when dragons ruled the skies. But something stirred within them. As Daenerys rose in power and confidence, Viserys grew jealous. He demanded his crown, and Drogo gave it to him, melting gold into a pot and pouring it over his head. Viserys died screaming, declaring himself the dragon. But true dragons do not burn. When Robert Baratheon learned Daenerys was pregnant, he feared the Targaryen name returning. Memories of Rhaegar haunted him. He ordered her assassination. The attempt failed. Ser Jorah Mormont, secretly watching over Dany, stopped it just in time. But Drogo swore vengeance. He promised to cross the narrow sea and burn Westeros to the ground. Yet, fate intervened. A wound he received in a skirmish festered. Infection spread, and Drogo, undefeated in battle, began to die. Desperate, Daenerys begged a healer, Mirri Maz Duur, to save him with blood magic. The woman agreed, but warned that death was the price for life. The cost was more than Dany imagined. Her unborn son died. Drogo survived, but only in body, empty, unmoving, no longer the man she loved. Dany ended his suffering herself. On the night of his funeral, Daenerys laid his body on a great pyre, along with the dragon eggs and the sorceress who betrayed her. Then, as the flames rose, she stepped into the fire and walked out unburnt. When the ashes cooled, Daenerys stood naked with 3 baby dragons clinging to her, the first in over a century. Fire had returned to the world, and so had the last dragon. Far to the north, beyond the wall, something ancient was awakening. Jon Snow, Ned Stark's illegitimate son, had joined the Night's Watch, like so many unwanted sons before him. But among the outcasts, criminals, and broken men of the Watch, Jon found something unexpected: brotherhood. Men who judged him for his actions, not his birth. When a corpse rose in the night and tried to strangle Lord Commander Jeor Mormont, Jon saved his life. For that, Mormont rewarded him with Longclaw, an ancient sword of Valyrian steel. There were fewer than 200 blades like it left in the world. Valyrian steel could cut through things normal swords couldn't, and Jon would need it, because the dead were walking again, and no one in the South cared. When news of Ned Stark's death reached the Wall, Jon was ready to abandon his post to join Robb's war. But his brothers reminded him of the oath he had taken. The Night's Watch does not take sides in the wars of kings. So Jon stayed. Honor bound him, even as his heart ached for home. The realm below was splintering. Robert's kingdom, the peace he'd kept for 17 years, was tearing itself apart. 5 men now called themselves kings. Each one had a claim, or thought they did. The War of the 5 Kings had begun. Ancient houses that had once stood together now raised their swords against each other. Brothers turned on brothers, fathers cast out sons. The Game of Thrones was no longer just politics, it was blood. In King's Landing, Queen Cersei ruled through her son, a boy king with a monster's heart. Tywin Lannister, her father, gathered the West's armies. Joffrey, delighting in cruelty, forced Sansa to stare at her father's head on a spike. He promised her that Robb's head would be next. The young girl who had once dreamed of being queen now lived as a prisoner in a golden cage. But winter was coming, and what winter brought was worse than the ambitions of kings. As the realm descended into war, the cost of power began to show. Robb Stark, the young wolf, had proven himself a true commander. He won 3 battles in a row against the Lannisters, a feat that stunned the realm. Though just barely 20, he led like a man born to rule. His direwolf, Grey Wind, fought beside him in every clash, a creature of terror and fury. The northern lords saw their king cut down seasoned knights and believed they had chosen well. But winning battles is not the same as winning wars. Robb sent terms to King's Landing, peace, in exchange for northern independence and the safe return of his sisters. Cersei read the message and laughed. She had no intention of rewarding rebellion, no matter how reasonable the demands. Her father, Tywin, was already raising the largest army Westeros had seen in generations. Meanwhile, the Baratheon brothers continued to undermine each other instead of uniting against the Lannisters. Stannis Baratheon was fueled by duty, rage, and now religion. He declared himself the one true king, both by law and by the will of the gods, but not the old gods, nor even the 7. He followed the Lord of Light, whose red priestess, Melisandre, spoke of fire and shadows and destiny. She saw things in the flames, visions, prophecies, and promised Stannis that victory would come at great cost. Renly Baratheon, on the other hand, embraced charm and spectacle. He married Marjorie Tyrell, securing the wealth and food of the Reach. His host was the largest in the realm. While Stannis talked of duty, Renly laughed with his knights and dreamed of wearing the crown. But laughter would not save him. Catelyn Stark, seeking allies, went south to treat with Renly. She found him playing at war like a tournament. He had named Brienne of Tarth, the towering warrior woman to his Kingsguard. She had beaten every knight in his melee and won his trust. Catelyn pleaded for peace between the brothers, but words could not heal wounds carved by pride and ambition. Then came the night everything changed. The night that should have united the Baratheon brothers became a night of horror. Melisandre, Stannis' Red Priestess, gave birth to something unnatural, a shadowy figure, shaped like a man, formed from blood magic. It moved like smoke and struck like steel. It found Renly in his tent. Brienne of Tarth, loyal and fierce, was with her king when the shadow came. She watched helplessly as it plunged a blade of darkness through Renly's chest. In a heartbeat, he was gone. His guards rushed in, saw Brienne over the body, and assumed she was the killer. Only Catelyn's quick words spared her. The two women fled into the night as Renly's great army collapsed. Without a leader, most of his bannermen bent the knee to Stannis, not out of love, but because they had no other choice. But not all forgot. House Tyrell remembered that Stannis had shown their daughter no kindness. That insult would cost him later. Brienne, feeling responsible and indebted, swore herself to Catelyn Stark. She would serve her until her last breath. Meanwhile, on the Iron Islands, Balon Greyjoy saw opportunity. While the rest of Westeros was at war, he crowned himself king once more and planned to strike the north while the wolves fought lions in the south. Robb Stark made a fateful decision. He sent Theon Greyjoy, his childhood friend and ward, to treat with Balon, hoping for ships and support. Theon had grown up with the Starks, more brother than hostage. But blood calls to blood. Balon saw in Theon a soft boy raised by wolves, not a true Ironborn. He mocked him, yet he gave Theon a chance to prove himself, take something valuable, something bold. Theon chose Winterfell. Winterfell, the ancient seat of House Stark, was lightly defended. Most of its men were with Robb in the south. Theon returned not as a friend, but as a conqueror. With just 20 men and knowledge of the castle's secrets, he seized it in a single night. Bran and Rickon Stark woke to find their home taken by someone they once trusted. Theon declared himself Prince of Winterfell, demanding the North accept him as their new lord. But the people remembered him as a boy, not a leader. They saw a traitor, not a ruler. When Sir Roderick Castle defied him, Theon had a choice: show mercy or command fear. He chose fear. He executed the old knight himself, and with every blow of the borrowed sword, something inside Theon broke. Bran and Rickon escaped that night, helped by Osha the wildling and Hodor, the gentle giant. They knew every secret passage in the castle from years of childhood games. Unable to find them, Theon committed an unthinkable act. He burned 2 farm boys and passed their charred bodies off as Bran and Rickon. The lie didn't work. The North knew their lord's sons, and they knew Theon Greyjoy's heart. The people did not bend to a butcher and a liar. Soon, Winterfell was surrounded. Theon's own Ironborn began to turn on him. When defeat was inevitable, his men knocked him out and surrendered, unwilling to die for his ambition. The fall of Winterfell sent shockwaves through the realm. Robb Stark had to divert troops north, just when every sword was needed in the south. But worse was the emotional cost. Theon's betrayal cut deeper than any blade. The boy Robb had called brother was now his enemy, and something inside the young king shifted that day. A part of him hardened forever. In the shadow of betrayal, Catelyn Stark made a choice that would divide the North. Her daughters were still in King's Landing, Sansa a prisoner of the crown, and Arya missing and presumed dead. Jaime Lannister, the Kingslayer, sat in chains. He was their only hope for a trade. So, one night, without her son's permission, Catelyn freed Jaime. She entrusted him to Brienne of Tarth, commanding her to escort him safely to the capital in exchange for the Stark girls. It was a desperate move, not political, but maternal. But it enraged the Northern Lords. They wanted Jaime dead for what he had done. Lord Rickard Karstark, who had lost 2 sons to Jaime's sword, felt Catelyn's act was betrayal, not mercy. The bond between Robb and his bannermen began to crack. Tensions rose even further as the war dragged on. In King's Landing, the Game of Thrones was being played at its highest level. Tyrion Lannister, sent to serve as acting hand of the king while Tywin fought in the field, arrived in a city on the brink of collapse. He saw Joffrey for what he was, a cruel boy with a crown, and set out to limit the damage. Tyrion removed Janos Slynt, who had played a part in Ned Stark's downfall, sending him to the wall. He exposed Grand Maester Pycelle as a Lannister puppet and locked him away. He sent Myrcella to Dorne, forging an alliance with a former enemy. But every action earned him more of his sister Cersei's hatred. She saw enemies in every shadow, including her brother, and believed power could be held through fear alone. She couldn't understand Tyrion's efforts to preserve the realm. She only saw him as a threat. Meanwhile, Joffrey's cruelty worsened. When a riot broke out in the streets, he nearly had Sansa killed by an angry mob. The Hound saved her life, pulling her to safety. But the incident showed how close the kingdom was to total collapse. The city teetered on the edge, and Tyrion knew war was coming. With Stannis Baratheon preparing to strike, Tyrion discovered a hidden weapon, wildfire. Deep beneath King's Landing, caches of the green, volatile substance, left over from the Mad King's reign, lay dormant. Wildfire burned hotter than normal fire. Water couldn't extinguish it. The Mad King had once planned to use it to destroy the city if he lost. Now, Tyrion would use it to save it. Stannis had built the largest fleet Blackwater Bay had ever seen. Ships filled the horizon as he sailed for the capital. His men were prepared to fight street by street. The Battle of Blackwater would decide the fate of the 7 kingdoms. Tyrion's trap was brutal and brilliant. He filled an old ship with wildfire and sent it drifting towards Stannis' fleet. When the ship exploded, green fire engulfed the bay, a tidal wave of flame and death. But Stannis didn't break. Through fire and chaos, he led the survivors ashore, His men fought fiercely, scaling the walls, breaching the mud gate. They believed in their king's cause, and they fought like it. Joffrey, faced with real danger, revealed his true self. He fled the battle, abandoning his men. Tyrion, half the size of those he commanded, led the defense himself. He rallied the city, inspired the soldiers, and held the line. The Hound, traumatized by the wildfire, walked away from the fight. He had seen enough fire in his life. He offered to take Sansa away with him, but she stayed. Somewhere, her family was still alive, and she couldn't abandon them. Stannis' men reached the gates. Victory was within reach. But just then, Tywin Lannister and Loras Tyrell arrived with fresh troops. The combined armies of the West and the Reach crushed Stannis' exhausted forces. The king, who had nearly taken the capital, was forced to flee. Tyrion, wounded and barely conscious, awoke to find himself forgotten. His father received all the glory. The dwarf who saved the city became a footnote. The Game of Thrones moved on, and even in victory, there were no heroes, only survivors. Far from the throne rooms and battlefields, other stories were unfolding, stories that would shape the fate of the realm. Arya Stark, now on the run, was learning what survival really meant. Disguised as a boy, she traveled north with Yoren and other recruits, heading to the Wall. But their group was captured by Lannister soldiers and taken to Harrenhal, a ruined castle turned torture camp. There, Arya found herself serving as cupbearer to Tywin Lannister, the very man whose armies had destroyed her family. She kept her head down and her name hidden, all while listening closely to his plans. But Arya carried a secret weapon. She had once saved a man named Jaqen H'ghar, a faceless man from Braavos. In return, he owed her 3 deaths. She named her targets carefully, eliminating threats one by one. When her time with Tywin ended, Jaqen gave her a coin and a phrase: Valar Morghulis, all men must die. It was more than a farewell. It was a key to a future that would change her forever. Beyond the Wall, Jon Snow faced his own transformation. He joined a scouting party led by Qhorin Halfhand to investigate the wildlings gathering in the Frostfangs. There, they captured a fiery young woman named Ygritte. She spoke of freedom, of living life on your own terms. She challenged everything Jon thought he knew. When the mission went wrong and they were captured, Qhorin made a brutal choice. He forced Jon to kill him. It was the only way Jon could earn the wildlings' trust and continue his mission as a spy. Jon was welcomed into Mance Rayder's army, but found himself torn between duty and compassion, between the Watch and the Wild. Back at the Fist of the First Men, Sam Tarly discovered something buried in the snow: obsidian blades, also known as dragon glass, ancient weapons left by brothers of the Watch who had once fought the darkness. Those blades could kill White Walkers, and they would need every single one in the war to come, because that war was closer than anyone realized. True threat revealed itself in silence and cold. As Sam hid among the snowdrifts at the Fist of the First Men, he saw it: the army of the dead. white walkers on skeletal horses, leading ranks of the reanimated, whites, once human, now enslaved by death. At their head rode the Night King. The world had long forgotten what he was, but he had not forgotten the world. The true war had begun, and no one in the south was ready for it. Meanwhile, across the narrow sea, Daenerys Targaryen was learning how to be a queen without a kingdom. She and her remaining followers crossed the Red Waste. Her dragons grew stronger each day, but her people were starving. They reached Karth, a city of wealth, masks, and secrets. There, Daenerys was offered everything: gold, ships, safety. But each offer came with a price. Zero Zoan Daxus wanted her hand in marriage, and her dragons. The warlock Pyat Pri lured her into the House of the Undying, hoping to trap her in visions and steal her power. But Daenerys was no longer a frightened girl. She entered the House of the Undying and saw haunting visions. A ruined throne room covered in snow, her dead husband, her unborn son, a crown she could never quite reach. When Pyat Pri tried to imprison her, Drogon breathed fire and destroyed the warlocks. Daenerys emerged from the flames, stronger, colder, changed. She dealt with Zero's betrayal by locking him in his own empty vault to die in darkness. The gold he promised was a lie, but his ships were real. She would use them, because her dragons were no longer infants. They were growing into weapons of war, and Daenerys was no longer a pawn. She was a player. Across the sea of ice and war, choices were shaping the fate of Westeros. Jon Snow was still embedded among the wildlings. He climbed the wall with them, risked his life beside them, and loved Ygritte. But love and duty are rarely allies. The wildlings, led by Mance Rayder, prepared to strike south. Jon knew he had to warn the Night's Watch, even if it meant breaking Ygritte's heart and his own. He escaped, and she shot him with 3 arrows as he fled. None were fatal, but all of them cut deep. He returned to Castle Black, barely alive, torn between 2 worlds, raised by the Watch, changed by the Wild. Meanwhile, chaos was tightening its grip on the realm. Robb Stark made a decision that would haunt him forever. He had promised to marry one of Walder Frey's daughters in exchange for passage across the Twins. But he broke that oath and married Talisa for love. It was a rare moment of happiness in a war of endless sacrifice. But love in war can be fatal. Catelyn's earlier decision to release Jaime had already strained the loyalty of Robb's bannermen. When he executed Rickard Karstark for murdering 2 Lannister boys, he lost the support of an entire house. With his forces weakened, Robb was forced to return to Walder Frey, not as a king, but as a beggar asking forgiveness. Walder agreed to a new alliance. Robb's uncle, Edmure Tully, would marry a Frey daughter in Robb's place. It was to be a wedding of peace. But peace was never Walder Frey's intention. He had already made a better deal with Tywin Lannister. At first, the wedding seemed like a celebration. Edmure Tully was pleased. His bride, Roslyn Frey, was kind and beautiful. The feast was grand, the wine flowed, and laughter echoed through the halls of the twins. But Catelyn Stark noticed something wrong. The musicians were playing the Rains of Castamere, a song that told the story of how Tywin Lannister had once destroyed an entire house for defying him. It wasn't a wedding tune, and by the time she understood the meaning, it was too late. The massacre began in an instant. Crossbows fired, blades flashed. Robb Stark took bolt after bolt to the chest before he could even rise. His pregnant wife, Talisa, was stabbed in the belly, again and again. Northern lords fell where they sat, with food still in their mouths, laughter frozen on their lips. Roose Bolton stepped from the shadows and whispered, "The Lannisters send their regards," before plunging a dagger into Robb's heart. Catelyn, in utter grief, grabbed one of Walder Frey's young wives and held a knife to her throat. She begged for her son's life, offered anything. Walder shrugged. He had plenty of wives. Black Walder slit Catelyn's throat as she screamed. The Starks, once the heart of the North, were wiped out in a single night. Grey Wind, Robb's dire wolf, was killed in his cage. His head was sewn onto Robb's body, paraded as a mockery. The king in the North reduced to a grotesque trophy. It wasn't just murder, it was betrayal of the highest order. Walder Frey had broken guest right, the most sacred custom in Westeros. No man was supposed to harm another under his roof after sharing bread and salt. But the Freys, the Boltons, and the Lannisters didn't care about honor. They cared about power. The Red Wedding shattered the North and changed Westeros forever. The Red Wedding sent tremors through every corner of the Seven Kingdoms. House Stark was broken. Their rebellion, crushed without a single Lannister soldier lost. Tywin Lannister had won the war not with armies, but with treachery. It was his masterpiece. Yet the cost was more than blood. Walder Frey had shattered the sacred law of guest right, something even the old gods condemned. It was a stain that would never wash away. In return for their loyalty, Tywin rewarded his conspirators. Roose Bolton was named Warden of the North. The flayed man of House Bolton now flew over castles that had belonged to the Starks for thousands of years. And his bastard son, Ramsay Snow, revealed himself to be a monster. While the war raged, Ramsay had captured Theon Greyjoy. What followed was not imprisonment, but torment. He flayed Theon, broke his mind, cut away his identity, piece by piece, until the proud Ironborn prince became Reek, a creature who flinched at shadows and obeyed without question. Ramsay sent pieces of Theon to Balon Greyjoy, a message that the North was no longer his for the taking. Balon pulled his forces back, unwilling to face the same fate as his son. In King's Landing, the Lannisters celebrated. Tywin had proven that fear was a sharper weapon than any sword. He immediately set about binding his enemies with marriages. Sansa Stark, now the last known heir of Winterfell, would marry Tyrion, giving the Lannisters a claim to the North. Cersei would be forced to marry Loras Tyrell, securing the alliance with the Reach. Love had no place in these arrangements. only power mattered. Sansa, who once dreamed of marrying princes, found herself chained by vows instead of iron. Tyrion did his best to be kind, but kindness could not erase grief. And Joffrey, ever cruel, made a show of it. He tormented his new aunt at her wedding feast, promising to serve her Rob's head on a platter. Sansa smiled through her tears, but inside, something was changing. The girl who once dreamed of crowns was learning how sharp they really were. While the capital bathed in its victories, new threats quietly took shape. Prince Oberyn Martell, the Red Viper of Dorne, arrived in King's Landing under the pretense of attending Joffrey's wedding, but his true purpose was revenge. His sister Elia had been murdered during Robert's rebellion. Her children had been butchered, and Oberyn had not forgotten. Meanwhile, Jaime Lannister returned to the city, changed. He had lost his sword hand, the symbol of everything he had once been, and he had gained something else: perspective. His long journey back with Brienne of Tarth had transformed him. She showed him that honor didn't have to die with his reputation. Jaime began to question the man he had been and the family he had served. But in King's Landing, good intentions meant little. His father Tywin barely acknowledged his sacrifice. His sister Cersei had grown colder in his absence. The man who saved the city from wildfire was treated like a relic. The Game of Thrones had no room for men trying to be better. And while alliances shifted in the light, darker moves unfolded in the shadows. Arya Stark, believed dead, had survived the Red Wedding. She saw her brother's body desecrated, his direwolf's head sewn onto his shoulders. She watched from the trees as Freymen boasted about killing Grey Wind, and then she acted. With needle in hand, Arya took her first life, not in battle, but in cold vengeance. She showed no fear, no regret. The girl who had once been afraid to hold a sword was becoming something else entirely. And far to the north, her brother Bran was following a different path, one that led beyond the wall, beyond the world of men. Bran Stark, once just a broken boy, was becoming something more. His journey north had led him into forgotten places. Alongside Mira and Jojen Reed, Hodor, and his brother Rickon, he sought the source of his strange visions, the three-eyed raven that whispered through his dreams. Bran had discovered he was a warg, able to enter the minds of animals and even, at times, people. He had seen through the eyes of birds, felt the wind with a wolf's instincts, slipped into Hodor's body when danger loomed. But his power ran deeper still. Jojen explained that Bran was a greenseer, someone who could glimpse the past and possibly the future. His destiny lay beyond the wall, where the raven waited in a cave of roots and bones. On their journey, they passed through the Night Fort, a haunted ruin steeped in ancient stories. There, they met Samwell Tarly, who had just escaped with Gilly and her newborn child. Sam pleaded with Bran to come south, where Jon could protect him. But Bran had chosen his path. He was done hiding. Sam gave him dragon glass daggers, the only known weapon against the White Walkers, and revealed the secret passage under the wall. Bran crossed into the true north, leaving the world of men behind. Because what lay ahead wasn't just snow and silence. It was something ancient, something waiting, and it had waited for him. Daenerys Targaryen had come a long way from the frightened girl sold to the Dothraki. Now she sailed into Slaver's Bay with dragons overhead and destiny at her back. Her first stop was Astapor, a city built on the backs of slaves. There, she encountered the Unsullied, an army of 8,000 eunuch soldiers trained since childhood to feel no pain, no fear, and no mercy. Perfect slaves, perfect weapons. The masters believed they were invincible. Daenerys let them believe that. She offered them a deal, her largest dragon, Drogon, in exchange for the army. But when the trade was complete, she turned to the Unsullied and spoke in flawless Valyrian, revealing her ruse. "Dracarys," she commanded. Drogon lit the slavers aflame. The Unsullied, no longer bound by fear, turned their spears on their masters. In one moment, the breaker of chains was born. But Dany didn't stop with conquest. She asked the Unsullied if they would follow her as free men, not property. They chose her. Yunkai fell soon after, not through brute force, but betrayal. Dario Naharis, a commander of the Second Sons, killed his own captains to serve her. Some men were drawn to her like moths to flame, and Daenerys burned brighter than all. The people called her Misa, Mother, and lifted her through the streets while her dragons roared above. For the first time since Aegon the Conqueror, dragons and their rider were reshaping nations. But ruling the free would prove harder than freeing the enslaved. And with every master she overthrew, she made new enemies. The wheel of power was beginning to turn, and Daenerys meant to break it. While thrones were claimed in fire and blood, the North faced something far worse: ice, death, and betrayal. The Night's Watch had ventured beyond the wall in force, the Great Ranging. But what they found was not wildlings or wolves. It was the dead. White Walkers turned their fallen into whites, cold, mindless creatures serving their will. At Craster's Keep, the survivors of the Watch took refuge with the wildling, who sacrificed his sons to the Walkers in exchange for peace. But hunger and fear rotted the Watch from within. Craster was murdered. Then Lord Commander Jor Mormont, the Old Bear, was betrayed by his own men. Stabbed in the back by those he had sworn to lead. The Night's Watch tore itself apart in blood and fire, while the true enemy gathered in the shadows. Sam Tarly fled with Gilly and her child, heading south toward the wall. But along the way, death found them. A White Walker came for Gilly's baby, perfect, male, innocent. Sam had always been afraid, always slow, always doubted. But love gave him courage. He stabbed the creature with a dragon glass dagger, and it shattered into shards of ice. The stories were real, and Sam, the coward, had killed the unkillable. He and Gilly pressed on toward Castle Black, carrying a warning and a weapon. Meanwhile, Jon Snow returned to the Wall, wounded both in body and heart. He had killed Qhorin Halfhand, lied to Ygritte, slept beside her, and then betrayed her. She had put 3 arrows in him as he fled, none of them fatal, but all unforgettable. Now he stood torn between 2 lives. The boy who belonged to no one now belonged to 2 worlds, and both would soon be at war. The Starks were scattered, dead, captured, or in hiding. The North was broken. The Boltons and Freys ruled in their place. The Lannisters sat on the Iron Throne, victorious, but rotting from within. Cersei clung to power through her son Tommen, now the next boy king. But without Tywin, the kingdom's foundation was weaker than ever. Sansa Stark, prisoner, pawn, and now wife to Tyrion, learned that survival meant silence and stillness. Her dreams of being queen had become a life of gilded captivity. But Littlefinger had other plans. When Joffrey was poisoned at his wedding, the infamous Purple Wedding, chaos erupted. Sansa vanished, spirited away by Littlefinger, who had orchestrated the assassination alongside Olenna Tyrell. Tyrion was blamed, thrown into a cell, tried for regicide. At his trial, Shae, the woman he had loved, testified against him. Her betrayal cut deeper than any blade. With no hope left, Tyrion demanded trial by combat. Prince Oberyn Martell, the Red Viper of Dorne, volunteered to fight for him. He wanted vengeance against Gregor Clegane, the Mountain, who had murdered his sister Elia. In one of the most brutal duels in Westeros history, Oberyn danced around the Mountain, wounding him repeatedly. He demanded a confession and got too close. The Mountain crushed his skull with his bare hands. Tyrion was sentenced to death. But Jaime freed his brother before the execution. Tyrion didn't flee immediately. Instead, he went to his father's chambers. There he found Shae in Tywin's bed. In that moment, Tyrion killed both his past and his future. He strangled Shae. Then he shot Tywin, the most powerful man in Westeros, with a crossbow while he sat on the privy. The lion had fallen, and Tyrion fled across the sea, toward exile, toward destiny. Back in the east, Daenerys had freed cities and broken chains. But ruling proved harder than conquest. Each step forward came with unseen costs. And in the far north, beyond the Wall, something colder than politics and bloodlines stirred. The White Walkers were no longer coming. They were here. The north was still bleeding from the Red Wedding. The wolves were gone, and the lions ruled. At King's Landing, Tywin Lannister melted down Ned Stark's greatsword Ice. From the steel of the Stark legacy, he forged 2 new blades, gifts for his sons. The message was clear. The Starks were gone, and the Lannisters would rise in their place. But even in victory, cracks were beginning to show. Tyrion Lannister, the hero of Blackwater, was still treated as a joke. His marriage to Sansa Stark was nothing but a political leash. She remained trapped, grieving her family, powerless to escape. Jaime returned to the capital, missing more than just his hand. Once the Kingslayer, feared and admired, now he struggled to fight with his left hand. Tywin called him no use as a knight and demanded he leave the Kingsguard to rule Casterly Rock. Jaime refused. He would not abandon his honor, not again. Cersei, once Jaime's lover and confidant, looked at him differently now. His captivity had changed them both. She pulled away, even as Joffrey, her son and her king, grew crueler by the day. And Joffrey was preparing for a wedding, a royal wedding. His bride-to-be, Margaery Tyrell, smiled sweetly, but played her own games. She knew how to win the hearts of the people, and how to soothe the temper of a king who loved to watch others suffer. But even Joffrey's wedding would not be about love. It would be about power and death. The wedding of King Joffrey Baratheon and Margaery Tyrell was a spectacle unlike anything the capital had seen in years. Gold and roses draped the great sept. The feast stretched for hours, with endless courses and entertainment meant to show off the power and wealth of two great houses. But the real performance came from Joffrey himself. He mocked his uncle Tyrion in front of the court, forced him to serve wine like a servant, laughed as dwarves reenacted the War of the Five Kings, mocking dead men, Renly, Robb, Stannis, and even Balon Greyjoy. Tyrion endured it silently, as he always had. Sansa tried to disappear into herself. Cersei watched everything with quiet pride. Then Joffrey ate a piece of pie and drank his wine. Moments later, he began to cough, choke. His face turned purple. He clawed at his throat as blood ran down his nose. The laughter turned to panic. Cersei screamed. Joffrey collapsed, gasping, pointing at Tyrion with a trembling finger, and then died in front of everyone. The boy who ruled like a tyrant, who murdered for amusement, who made the realm bleed, died in a puddle of spilled wine and silence. Cersei turned to Tyrion. With grief and fury in her eyes, she ordered his arrest. The wedding feast had become a funeral. The king was dead, the blame was cast, and the game had changed once more. King Joffrey's death sent shockwaves through King's Landing. With the body barely cold, Cersei began her warpath. She was certain Tyrion had killed her son, and she wanted blood. Tyrion was thrown into the dungeons, awaiting a trial that would be anything but fair. But while all eyes turned to the accused, the real murderers sat quietly at the high table. Lady Olenna Tyrell, the Queen of Thorns, had seen enough of Joffrey's cruelty. With Littlefinger's help, she arranged his death to save her granddaughter, Margaery, from a lifetime of torment. Sansa Stark vanished during the chaos. Whisked away by Sir Dantos, she was delivered to a ship where Peter Baelish waited. Littlefinger had orchestrated the entire escape. The necklace Sansa wore held the poison that killed Joffrey. And now, the last known Stark girl in the capital was in his hands. He sailed with her to the Vale, to her aunt Lisa Arryn, the woman who had started the war by poisoning her husband, Jon Arryn, at Peter's urging. Littlefinger had played every side from the beginning. Meanwhile, Tyrion sat alone in the dark, knowing the odds were stacked against him. His champion, Oberyn Martell, promised to fight for him. But revenge, not justice, was Oberyn's goal. In his mind, he was already fighting the Mountain, Gregor Clegane, the monster who had raped and killed his sister Elia during Robert's rebellion. Tyrion, once a player in the game, was now a pawn waiting for judgment. And outside the capital, the world kept turning. Prince Oberyn Martell, the Red Viper of Dorne, stepped into the ring to fight for Tyrion Lannister. But he wasn't there to save the accused. He was there for justice. He was there for blood. His opponent was Sir Gregor Clegane, the Mountain, a man so large, so brutal, he was more beast than knight. Gregor had murdered Oberyn's sister, Elia, and her children. This was Oberyn's moment to make him confess, and at first, it looked like he might win. Oberyn danced around the mountain, striking with speed and poisoned spear. Blow after blow, he wounded the giant. The crowd roared. Tyrion dared to hope. But Oberyn made one mistake. He needed a confession. He circled his wounded opponent, demanding the mountain speak his crimes. He got too close. Gregor grabbed him and crushed his skull with his bare hands. Oberyn's death sealed Tyrion's fate. The trial by combat had failed, and now the sentence was death. But Tyrion wasn't finished yet. In the dark of night, Jaime freed his brother. Together with Varys, they prepared his escape. But Tyrion couldn't leave without confronting the ghosts that haunted him. He found Shae, the woman he had loved, in his father's bed. Betrayal burned deep. He strangled her with the chain she wore. Then he went to Tywin, the man who had condemned him to die, the man who never once treated him as a son. Tyrion shot his father with a crossbow while he sat on the privy. The most powerful man in Westeros died on the toilet, not with glory, but with shame. Tyrion fled into exile. Varys closed the crate, heard the bells of morning, and chose to vanish with him. The lions had torn themselves apart. At Castle Black, the storm was coming. Jon Snow had returned from beyond the wall with a warning. Mance Rayder's army, 100,000 strong, was marching south. Wildlings, giants, and mammoths gathered under one banner. They didn't want conquest. They wanted to survive. The real enemy, the White Walkers, were coming, and Mance meant to bring his people behind the wall before it was too late. But the Night's Watch had only a few hundred men. Jon, now a seasoned warrior, urged the brothers to prepare. Alliser Thorne, still bitter, gave him command of nothing. But when the time came, when the horns blew and the wall shook, it was Jon who led. The Battle of Castle Black wasn't just fought at the gates. Wildlings climbed the wall. Giants rode mammoths and smashed the outer doors. Tormund Giantsbane led the attack from the south. Ygritte, bow in hand, hunted crows with vengeance in her heart. The brothers of the Watch fought with desperation and fire. Grenn held the inner gate against a giant. He and his brothers died with blades in hand, reciting the Night's Watch oath as they stood their ground. Jon fought bravely, but when he came face to face with Ygritte, bow drawn, neither could shoot. She hesitated, and that's when the arrow struck, from Ollie, the boy whose village she had burned. Ygritte died in Jon's arms, her last words a whisper of their lost love. "You know nothing, Jon Snow." At sunrise, the battle was won, but the cost was carved into every wall, every face, every grave. Jon walked into the forest alone to treat with Mance, ready to die if needed. But just as the two men began to speak, a new army arrived. Stannis Baratheon, riding north with banners high and swords drawn. The king of the Narrow Sea had come to the wall. Jon Snow stood between two kings. On one side, Mance Rayder, the king beyond the wall, who united the wildlings not for conquest, but for survival. On the other, Stannis Baratheon, the rightful heir by blood, come north to protect the realm from threats the South refused to see. Jon asked Stannis for mercy. Mance had shown him honor, but Mance refused to kneel. Even in chains, he stayed true to who he was. Stannis offered him one last chance to submit. When Mance refused again, Melisandre, the Red Priestess, sentenced him to burn alive. As the flames rose and the crowd watched in silence, Jon stepped forward and put an arrow through Mance's heart, a final gift of dignity. The war between wildlings and crows was over, but the real war, the one that lay beyond the wall, was still to come. Meanwhile, in the Vale, Sansa Stark was shedding her mask of fear. Littlefinger had married her aunt, Lysa Arryn, and secured his place as Lord Protector of the Vale. But when Lysa caught Sansa and Petyr sharing a moment, her jealousy turned violent. Lysa dragged Sansa to the moon door, threatening to throw her to her death. Petyr whispered soothing words, then shoved Lysa through the door instead. He lied to the lords of the Vale, saying Lysa's death was suicide. Sansa backed his story, but not as a frightened girl, as a Stark learning how to lie. She had changed her name, her clothes, her voice. But for the first time, she was playing the game on her own terms. Sansa was no longer a pawn. She was learning to be a player. Daenerys Targaryen had conquered Slaver's Bay. But ruling it was another matter. In Meereen, she was queen, not by birth, but by fire and fear. The former masters hated her. The freed slaves adored her. And in between stood chaos. The sons of the Harpy, masked insurgents, began striking from the shadows, murdering unsullied in the streets. The revolution was far from over. One of Daenerys's closest advisors, Sir Barristan Selmy, once Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, tried to guide her with honor. But honor was hard to maintain in a city built on blood. Then came the hardest choice yet. She discovered that one of her most loyal men, Jorah Mormont, had once spied on her for King Robert. His betrayal had helped her enemies nearly kill her. Though he had long since changed sides, Dany was heartbroken. She banished Jorah from the city. And then came the matter of the dragons. Drogon, the largest and wildest, had vanished, but the others, Viserion and Rhaegal, remained in the catacombs. When a farmer came to her, begging for justice, and showed her the charred bones of his daughter, killed by one of her dragons, Dany faced a terrible truth. She couldn't control them. With tears in her eyes, she chained the 2 remaining dragons in the dark. The breaker of chains had become the jailer of her own children. Power, she was learning, had a price, and sometimes so did mercy. Bran Stark's journey finally led him to the cave of the Three-Eyed Raven, a place whispered of in dreams. As he and his companions reached the entrance, they were attacked by skeletal wights, ancient dead that rose from the snow. Jojen Reed was killed, and Mira barely survived. But just as all seemed lost, a child of the forest hurled flaming magic, driving the creatures back. Inside the cave, protected from the White Walkers, Bran met the Three-Eyed Raven. Not a bird, but an old man tangled in roots and memory. He told Bran, "You will never walk again, but you will fly." A new kind of power was awakening in the north. Meanwhile, Arya Stark and Sandor Clegane, the Hound, traveled across a war-torn landscape. Arya learned from him, but never forgave. Her list of names grew shorter, her heart colder. When they reached the Vale, hoping to ransom Arya to her aunt, they found Lysa dead. Denied her family again, Arya Cuckols laughed. The world's cruelty had finally stopped surprising her. On the way back, they were ambushed by Brienne of Tarth. She had come to fulfill her vow to Catelyn Stark, to find and protect her daughters. But the Hound wouldn't let Arya go easily. Brienne and the Hound fought viciously, steel clashing, fists breaking, bones shattering. Brienne won, but Arya refused to go with her. Instead, she approached the dying Hound. He begged for mercy. She stared at him and walked away. She boarded a ship to Braavos, coin in hand, whispering the words Jaqen H'ghar had taught her. Valar Morghulis, all men must die. Arya Stark was no longer a little girl from Winterfell. She was something else now, and her path would lead far from Westeros. The war for the throne had quieted, but the real battles were only beginning. In King's Landing, the death of Tywin Lannister had left a power vacuum. Cersei, freed from her father's shadow, moved quickly to consolidate control. But ruling without Tywin was like walking without a spine. She surrounded herself with loyalists, men who would nod, not challenge. Tommen Baratheon, her younger son, now sat on the Iron Throne. Gentle, impressionable, and in love with Margaery Tyrell, the perfect target. Margaery, ever cunning, moved quickly. She became queen, married Tommen, and charmed the people. Cersei saw the threat, another woman whispering in her son's ear. But her answer wasn't politics. It was faith. She armed the Sparrows, a religious movement obsessed with cleansing the wicked. She gave them steel and power, and they turned their eyes not just on criminals, but on sinners. Meanwhile, in the north, Roose Bolton ruled Winterfell. The man who betrayed the Starks at the Red Wedding now wore their crown, and his son, Ramsay, cruel, cunning, and uncontrollable, had a plan to secure their hold. He would marry a Stark. Sansa Stark, thought dead, was brought to Winterfell by Littlefinger. She had trusted him, the man who murdered her aunt, betrayed her family, and handed her to monsters. But Sansa had changed. No longer the bird in a cage, she returned to the home that had once been her childhood, now filled with enemies. The girl who once dreamed of princes was preparing to play her part in a far more dangerous game. Excited, across the narrow sea, in Meereen, Daenerys Targaryen faced rebellion. The Sons of the Harpy, loyalists to the old slave-owning families, struck from the shadows. They ambushed Unsullied, slaughtered her soldiers, killed in the streets to make the people fear freedom. One of the victims was Sir Barristan Selmy, the noble knight who had once served her father and pledged himself to her cause. His death shook Daenerys. He had been her anchor, her wisdom. With no one left to temper her, Dany turned to fire and blood. She rounded up the leaders of Meereen's great families. One of them would pay for the son's crimes. She had him dragged before a dragon and watched as he burned alive. Tyrion Lannister, now a fugitive, traveled east with Varys, their destination, Meereen. The plan: offer Tyrion's mind to Daenerys' cause. But along the way, they were captured by slavers, and then by Jorah Mormont. Jorah, exiled and desperate for redemption, planned to deliver Tyrion as a gift to his queen. But neither of them would arrive as they hoped. Back in Westeros, Jon Snow faced choices of his own. Stannis Baratheon remained at the Wall, demanding the loyalty of the North. He offered Jon something no one else had: the Stark name, a title, a future. But when the vote came for Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, Jon won. He declined Stannis' offer, choosing duty over name. The boy who once dreamed of being a Stark now led the Wall. But leadership came with bitter decisions. He offered land and safety to the wildlings, the same people who had killed his brothers, knowing they were the only hope against the army of the dead. Many in the Watch called him traitor, but Jon had seen what was coming, and names wouldn't matter when the night came for them all. In King's Landing, Cersei's weapon, the Faith Militant, turned on her. At first, it was perfect. The High Sparrow, a humble and charismatic leader, promised to cleanse the capital of sin. With Cersei's blessing, the Sparrows arrested Loras Tyrell for his homosexuality. But the Faith didn't stop there. They arrested Queen Margaery too, for lying under oath. Cersei smiled. Then the trap closed on her. She was accused of adultery, incest, and regicide. Her cousin Lancel, once her lover, confessed everything. And the Faith, empowered by her own decree, threw her into a cell. For the first time, Cersei was powerless, filthy, alone. Far to the east, in the House of Black and White, Arya Stark began her training with the Faceless Men. She scrubbed corpses, washed their skin, learned to let go of her name. But Arya didn't want to forget. She wanted revenge. When she saw Sir Meryn Trant, a name on her kill list, in Braavos, abusing young girls, she couldn't resist. Disguised, she stabbed him in the eyes, chest, and groin. Slowly, methodically, she had broken the rules of the faceless men, and the punishment was swift. She lost her sight. Meanwhile, in the north, Sansa Stark lived a nightmare. She had married Ramsay Bolton, a union meant to unite the North under Bolton rule. But Ramsay was no husband. He brutalized her, humiliated her, used Theon, now a shattered creature called Reek, to watch. Sansa, once naive, now carried fury in her silence. And as winter began to fall, she looked for escape or vengeance. Jon Snow, now Lord Commander, made his most dangerous decision yet. He sailed north with a small force to meet the wildlings at Hardhome, a fishing village beyond the wall. His goal was simple: save as many as possible from the coming storm. Many wildlings refused. Some remembered the crows too well, but thousands agreed to follow Jon. Then the dead arrived. White walkers stood on the cliffs, silent and cold. Their army surged like a tide, whites clawing through fire and snow. Chaos erupted. Screams filled the air. Jon fought one of the walkers, and when his sword Longclaw met its blade, something impossible happened. Valyrian steel stopped it. He killed the White Walker, proving they weren't invincible. But it didn't matter. As Jon and the survivors fled by boat, the Night King stepped forward and raised his arms. The fallen, wildlings, brothers, children, rose with blue eyes. Jon watched in horror as the army of the dead grew larger, without a sound. Meanwhile, in Meereen, Daenerys faced rebellion inside her own walls. At the reopening of the fighting pits, meant to please the people, the Sons of the Harpy struck again. They slaughtered civilians and unsullied alike. Daenerys was surrounded. Jorah Mormont, once exiled, fought his way to her side. Tyrion helped defend her, but they were trapped. And then Drogon came. Her largest dragon swept into the pit, burning attackers with fire and fury. Dany climbed onto his back and flew away. For the first time in centuries, a Targaryen rode a dragon over the skies of Essos. But freedom came at a cost. She disappeared into the wilderness, alone. Winter pressed harder in the north. Stannis Baratheon, camped outside Winterfell, faced bitter truth. Food was running out, men were deserting, and Ramsay Bolton's night raids were breaking morale. Desperate to keep his claim alive, Melisandre offered a final solution: a sacrifice to the Lord of Light. Not just any sacrifice. His daughter, Princess Shireen. Despite her innocence, despite her love for her father, Stannis allowed it. Shireen was burned alive, screaming for her parents. Her mother collapsed in grief. Half the army abandoned him, and still, Stannis marched on Winterfell, only to be crushed. His soldiers were slaughtered. His wife hanged herself. Melisandre fled. Stannis himself was found by Brienne of Tarth, who had come to execute justice for Renly Baratheon, her king, whom Stannis had murdered with shadow magic. She executed Stannis beneath the snow. Inside Winterfell, Sansa saw her chance. She lit a candle in the tower, a signal for help, but no one came. In the chaos after the battle, she confronted Reek, Theon, and begged him to remember who he was. When Ramsay's lover, Miranda, threatened Sansa with a bow, Theon acted. He shoved Miranda to her death. Then, with Ramsay's army returning, he and Sansa leapt from the castle walls into the snow, risking everything to escape. Meanwhile, Daenerys was stranded in the Dothraki Sea. Her dragon, Drogon, wounded and wild, refused to return her home, and out of the tall grass came thousands of riders, a new Khalasar, surrounding the last Dragon Queen. In Braavos, Arya Stark disobeyed the Faceless Men again. She was sent to kill a corrupt gambler, but instead, she followed Sir Meryn Trant's killer replacement, a pedophile and sadist from her list. She murdered him brutally, but the price for vengeance was steep. Jaqen H'ghar took his own life, or so it seemed, only for another face to appear in his place. Arya learned the faces were masks, and death wore many. Then, as punishment, Arya went blind. In King's Landing, Cersei's sins came crashing down. After weeks of imprisonment, she confessed to adultery, but not to incest with Jaime. The High Sparrow allowed her to return to the Red Keep, but not without punishment. She was stripped naked, her hair shorn, and forced to walk through the city while the crowd hurled insults, filth, and stones. She bled shame with every step. When she finally reached the gates, broken and trembling, Qyburn greeted her and introduced her new protector, Sir Robert Strong, a silent giant, reanimated from the corpse of the mountain. In Meereen, with Daenerys missing, Tyrion, Grey Worm, and Missandei worked to maintain order. Jorah and Daario set out to find their queen. Far away, Dany stood surrounded by a new Khalasar. She dropped her ring in the grass, a sign, a breadcrumb for those who might follow. And at the wall, Jon Snow paid the ultimate price for leadership. His decision to ally with the wildlings had divided the Night's Watch. And then came the betrayal. One by one, his brothers called him traitor and stabbed him. Last was Ollie, the boy Jon had saved, who drove a knife into his heart. Jon collapsed in the snow, his blood pooling beneath him. The Lord Commander of the Night's Watch died under the stars, alone. Jon Snow lay dead in the courtyard of Castle Black. His brothers had betrayed him. His blood soaked the snow. His dire wolf, Ghost, howled from behind bars. But death in the world of ice and fire is not always the end. Davos Seaworth, loyal to Jon's cause even in death, discovered his body and, with help from a few loyal brothers and the wildling giant 1-1, took control of the room. They locked Jon's body away and prepared to make a stand against Alliser Thorne and the mutineers. But Davos had another idea. He turned to the one person who might have power beyond death, Melisandre. Yet even the Red Woman had lost her faith. After Stannis' defeat, after burning a child for nothing, she was hollow. Her magic had failed her, but Davos begged her to try. In private, Melisandre removed her robes and revealed her true self, a withered old woman, kept young by illusion. Her time was fading, but she attempted the ritual anyway. She washed Jon's body, cut his hair, burned strands in the fire, and whispered in Valyrian. Then, silence. Nothing happened. One by one, they left the room, and just when all hope seemed gone, Jon Snow opened his eyes. Jon Snow was alive, but haunted. He remembered the blades, the betrayal, the pain. And now, returned from death, he questioned everything. Why was he spared? What was he meant to do? But one thing was clear. He was done serving the Night's Watch. After executing the traitors who murdered him, including young Ollie and Alliser Thorne, Jon passed the Lord Commander's cloak to Ed. My watch is ended. Meanwhile, at Winterfell, Ramsay Bolton cemented his place as the most monstrous man in the North. When his father Roose welcomed a new son into the world, a threat to Ramsay's claim, Ramsay murdered him, then fed his stepmother and infant brother to his hounds. No longer a bastard, Ramsay now ruled the North through blood and fear. Sansa, having survived her escape with Theon, reached Castle Black. Her reunion with Jon, the first time two Stark children had seen each other in years, was tender, hesitant, but real. They had both changed, hardened. Sansa urged Jon to retake Winterfell. You're the last true Stark, she told him. You're the one they'll follow. Jon hesitated. He was tired of fighting. But when a letter from Ramsay arrived, threatening to kill Rickon Stark and describing Sansa in horrifying detail, Jon chose war. Meanwhile, across the narrow sea, Daenerys was a prisoner once again. Captured by a new Khalasar, she was taken to Vaes Dothrak, where widows of Khals were meant to live out their days in silence. But Daenerys had no intention of staying. She challenged the Dothraki leaders. When they threatened her, she acted. Locked inside the temple with the Khals, she set the structure ablaze and walked out, naked and unburnt, as the flames consumed them all. The Dothraki fell to their knees. Daenerys was no longer just a queen. She was a goddess of fire. In the north, Jon and Sansa began rallying support to retake Winterfell. They rode to House Mormont, where the fierce young Lady Lyanna, only 10 years old, commanded respect far beyond her years. Though her soldiers were few, her loyalty was unshakable. Determined, the North remembers. Other houses were less eager. The Boltons held power, and fear still ruled the North. But Sansa wrote a letter to someone unknown as a final gamble. Meanwhile, in the Riverlands, another long-lost figure reappeared. Sandor Clegane, the Hound. He had survived, nursed back to health by a peaceful community of builders, led by a kind Septon. He tried to live a quiet life, but peace never lasts in Westeros. The Brotherhood without banners slaughtered the community, and the Hound returned to violence, axe in hand. In the capital, the tides turned quickly. Cersei, stripped of power, waited for her trial. But the High Sparrow was playing a deeper game. He manipulated King Tommen, bringing him closer to the faith and away from his mother. Tommen announced a union between the crown and the faith, removing trial by combat. Cersei's one path to safety. She had enemies on all sides. But she was quietly planning something far more dangerous than defense. And in Braavos, Arya Stark faced a final test. The faceless men ordered her to kill a theater actress, but Arya refused. She had reclaimed her name. When the waif came to kill her for disobedience, Arya turned the tables, fighting blind, wounded, and determined. She killed the waif and left a message behind, a face and a name. Determined, a girl is Arya Stark of Winterfell, she said. Determined, and I'm going home. In the far north, Bran Stark trained beneath the roots of the weirwood tree. The three-eyed raven showed him visions, fragments of the past, glimpses of the future, pieces of a puzzle that spanned centuries. Bran saw his father Ned as a boy. He saw the Mad King shouting, "Burn them all." He saw the creation of the White Walkers, not by nature, but by magic. The children of the forest had plunged dragonglass into a man's heart to create a weapon against mankind, only to unleash something worse. But Bran grew impatient. One night, he entered a vision without the raven's guidance. He saw the army of the dead, and the Night King saw him back. The mark he left on Bran's arm shattered the magic barrier protecting the cave. The walkers came. Whites poured into the hollow. The raven was struck down. Summer, Bran's direwolf, died fighting. The children of the forest sacrificed themselves in a blaze of fire, and Hodor, gentle, loyal Hodor, held the door. Bran had warged into Hodor's younger self through the past. The trauma of that moment, of knowing he would die to protect Bran, broke his mind. Hold the door, Hodor. The name wasn't nonsense. It was a command, a fate. Hodor died holding back death itself, and Bran escaped, carrying not just grief, but power. He was now the three-eyed raven. Meanwhile, in Meereen, Tyrion negotiated peace with the masters of Slaver's Bay, offering a temporary truce. But Daenerys returned atop Drogon, and she had no interest in compromise. In Meereen, the masters broke their truce, unleashing fire and siege upon the city. But Daenerys returned not just with Drogon, but with all 3 dragons. She burned their ships. Her Dothraki crushed the sons of the Harpy in the streets. Tyrion stood beside her, not just as an advisor, but as hand of the queen. They had reclaimed the city. To rule the 7 kingdoms, Dany needed allies. She found them in unexpected places. Yara and Theon Greyjoy fled the Iron Islands after Euron Greyjoy murdered their father and claimed the Salt Throne. In Meereen, they offered their ships in exchange for support in reclaiming the Iron Islands. Dany accepted. Meanwhile, in King's Landing, Cersei faced her trial, but she never intended to attend. As bells rang and the sept filled with nobles, Cersei waited in silence, dressed in black, sipping wine. Beneath the city, Qyburn's little birds killed Grand Maester Pycelle and lured Lancel Lannister into the catacombs, where he discovered wildfire barrels set to explode. He was too late. The great sept of Baelor erupted in green flame, destroying the Faith, the Tyrells, and everyone within. Cersei crowned herself queen atop a ruined kingdom. Tommen, shattered by the destruction and his mother's cruelty, removed his crown and leapt from the window. At Winterfell, the battle was coming. Jon Snow, Sansa Stark, and their small army stood against Ramsay Bolton, who held Rickon hostage and commanded the North's strongest forces. The Battle of the Bastards began. Ramsay murdered Rickon before the fight. Jon charged alone, surrounded and nearly crushed beneath the chaos. Only when the Knights of the Vale, summoned by Sansa's secret letter to Littlefinger, arrived did the tide turn. Ramsay fled to Winterfell, but was defeated and finally given to his own starving hounds. Sansa watched as they tore him apart. For the first time in years, the Stark banners flew again over Winterfell. At Winterfell, Jon Snow was hailed as the new king in the North. The Northern lords rallied behind him, led by the fierce voice of young Lady Lyanna Mormont. Despite his birth, despite the secrets, they believed in Jon. "The North remembers," they shouted. But in the shadows, Littlefinger whispered to Sansa, "You're the true-born Stark, he's not." Seeds of doubt were being sown. Far beyond the wall, Bran Stark reached the final vision, the one he had always been meant to see. He returned to the Tower of Joy, where a young Ned Stark found his sister Lyanna dying in childbirth. She whispered something to him. We saw only parts, but the truth was clear. The child was not Ned's, he was Lyanna's, and Rhaegar Targaryen's. That child was Jon Snow. The bastard of Winterfell had Targaryen blood, the blood of fire and dragons. Back in Dorne, vengeance spread. Olenna Tyrell, having lost her entire family in Cersei's explosion, allied with Ellaria Sand and the Sand Snakes. Together they welcomed a powerful guest, Varys, emissary of Daenerys Targaryen. And across the sea, the game finally shifted. Daenerys set sail for Westeros. Her fleet, massive and glorious, carried unsullied Dothraki, Greyjoys, Tyrells, Martells, and 3 dragons. At her side stood Tyrion Lannister, whom she had just named Hand of the Queen. The last shot of the season, the dragons soaring above the waves, the fleet slicing through the sea, and Daenerys Targaryen, the Stormborn, finally heading home. Winter had come. Snow fell across Westeros, and with it came war. At the Twins, Arya Stark wore a new face, that of Walder Frey. She poisoned his entire house, wiping out the men who had betrayed her family at the Red Wedding. "The North remembers," she whispered. "Tell them winter came for House Frey." In the North, Jon Snow ruled as king. He called on the lords of Westeros to unite, not against each other, but against the Night King. He needed dragonglass, the only known weapon against the undead. And he needed allies. His focus was survival. Sansa's was power. Tension grew between them as Littlefinger stirred the embers of doubt, reminding Sansa that she was a true-born Stark, while Jon was not. Far to the south, Queen Cersei sat on the Iron Throne. With her children gone, her grip on power was absolute, but fragile. Surrounded by enemies, she sought one powerful ally, Euron Greyjoy. Euron arrived in King's Landing with a fleet and a promise. He offered Cersei a gift, one that would prove his loyalty and win her hand. And across Across the sea, Daenerys Targaryen finally reached Westeros. She landed at Dragonstone, the ancestral seat of House Targaryen, and stood in silence as she touched the stone walls of her birthplace. Then, with Tyrion beside her, she uttered her first words on Westerosi soil. Daenerys moved swiftly to secure her position. At Dragonstone, Jon Snow arrived to meet her, summoned by Tyrion to form an alliance against the Night King. But their meeting was tense. Dany demanded he bend the knee. Jon refused. He had come for dragonglass, not politics. Tyrion urged compromise, and Daenerys agreed. Jon would mine the dragonglass beneath Dragonstone. In the south, Euron Greyjoy struck fast. He ambushed Yara and Theon's fleet, slaughtering their men and capturing Yara, Ellaria Sand, and Tyene, his gift for Queen Cersei. Back in King's Landing, Cersei took her revenge. She imprisoned Ellaria and forced her to watch as Tyene, her daughter, was poisoned with the same toxin Ellaria had used on Myrcella. "You will watch her die. You will watch her rot," Cersei promised. Meanwhile, Daenerys' allies began to fall apart. Her plan, crafted by Tyrion, failed. The Unsullied captured Casterly Rock, only to find it nearly empty. Jaime Lannister had marched west and conquered Highgarden, home of House Tyrell. Lady Olenna was captured, but she didn't beg for her life. Instead, she revealed one final truth. Thoughtful. "Tell Cersei," chuckles, "I want her to know it was me." Olenna Tyrell had poisoned Joffrey, and now, with her house destroyed, she died on her own terms, proud, sharp, and unapologetic. Daenerys had tried diplomacy. Now, she was ready for fire. Daenerys was done playing games. After watching her allies fall and her enemies gain ground, she took action, not with soldiers, but with fire. The Lannister army, fresh from sacking Highgarden, marched home heavy with gold and supplies. They never made it. Dothraki screamers charged from the hills, and Drogon descended from the sky. It wasn't a battle. It was annihilation. Soldiers burned where they stood. Wagons exploded. Horses panicked. Jaime Lannister fought bravely, charging straight at Daenerys with a spear. But Drogon turned toward him, flames surging. Only Bronn's last-second dive saved Jaime, plunging them both into the river. The survivors were brought before Daenerys. She gave them a choice: bend the knee or burn. Randall and Dickon Tarly refused. She executed them with dragonfire. In the north, Jon showed Daenerys the dragon glass and cave paintings, ancient drawings of the first men and the White Walkers fighting together. She believed him, a little, and then Drogon landed beside Jon. The dragon allowed Jon to touch him, a rare, silent recognition. Back at Winterfell, Arya Stark returned home. Her reunion with Sansa was cold, cautious. Both had changed too much to embrace easily. But Arya proved she wasn't the girl who left. She sparred with Brienne of Tarth, moving like a shadow. Sansa watched, disturbed and impressed. Bran also returned, but he was no longer her brother. He had become the three-eyed raven. Thoughtful. "I remember everything," he said. Memories, visions, truths yet to be spoken. And far beyond the wall, the Night King marched, slow, steady, unstoppable. Jon Snow knew words wouldn't be enough. To convince Daenerys and Cersei of the threat from the north, he needed proof. He formed a small band, the Suicide Squad of Westeros. Jon, Tormund, Jorah, Gendry, the Hound, Beric Dondarrion, and Thoros of Myr, all men from different causes and past betrayals, marched beyond the wall to capture a white. In the blinding snow, they fought undead bears. Thoros died from his wounds, but they pressed on. They succeeded, capturing a single white. But then, they were trapped. Surrounded by the Night King's army on a frozen lake, they held out on a rock as the ice cracked and death circled them. Gendry ran for help. Daenerys flew north with her dragons. She arrived just in time, burning thousands of whites, rescuing the men, but not before the Night King struck. He hurled an ice spear through the sky, straight into Viserion. The dragon crashed into the ice, bled out, and sank into the black water. Daenerys, devastated, escaped with the survivors. Jon nearly didn't make it, pulled under and left for dead. But Benjen Stark, half dead himself, arrived and sacrificed his chance to escape, giving Jon one last ride to safety. Back at Eastwatch, Jon swore fealty to Daenerys. Solemnly, "You are my queen," he told her. Weeping, she wept for her dragon, but a bond had formed between them, forged in fire and loss. But beneath the ice, the Night King had not forgotten. Chains were hauled, ice cracked, and from the depths rose Viserion, reborn. Eyes blue, wings torn, undead. The Night King now had a dragon. A temporary truce was called. At the Dragon Pit in King's Landing, all the great players assembled. Cersei, Jaime, Tyrion, Jon Snow, Daenerys Targaryen, the Hound, Brienne, and more. Enemies stood side by side, if only for a moment. Jon and his team revealed the captured white. It roared, lunged, and clawed, undeniable proof that the dead were real. Cersei agreed to a truce, but only if Jon swore neutrality in the coming war. Jon refused. Determined, "I already pledged myself to Queen Daenerys." Cersei stormed off, enraged. Tyrion followed her alone, risking his life to speak with the sister who had tried to kill him. Somehow, he persuaded her to return. Cersei returned to the group and promised her armies would march north. But it was a lie. In secret, she revealed to Jaime that she never intended to help. Euron had gone to fetch the Golden Company, a mercenary army from Essos, to secure her throne. Jaime, disgusted, finally walked away from her. As snow began to fall on King's Landing, he rode north. At Winterfell, Littlefinger made his final move. trying to drive a wedge between Arya and Sansa. But the sisters saw through him. In a shocking twist, Sansa summoned him to the Great Hall and accused him of murder, treason, and betrayal. Arya slit his throat as he begged. The North was no longer a place for schemers. Back at sea, Jon and Daenerys came together, intimately, unaware of the truth Bran had uncovered. With Samwell Tarly's help, Bran confirmed Jon's true parentage. He wasn't Jon Snow. He was Aegon Targaryen, son of Rhaegar and Lyanna, a legitimate heir to the Iron Throne. And far to the north, at the Wall, the army of the dead arrived. The Night King rode undead Viserion through the sky. With a single blast of blue fire, the Wall was breached. Ice crumbled, stone shattered. The dead poured through. Winter had truly come. The living prepared for war. At Winterfell, armies gathered. Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen arrived with the Unsullied, Dothraki, and 2 dragons. But not everyone welcomed them. The Northerners were wary of a foreign queen. And Sansa, now a true leader in her own right, questioned Daenerys' intentions. Tension simmered between the 2 women from the start. Arya reunited with Jon after years apart, a rare moment of warmth. But even Arya warned him, "Don't forget your family." Meanwhile, Jaime Lannister arrived alone at Winterfell, ready to fight for the living. But he faced his own reckoning. Bran waited for him in silence, the boy he'd once pushed from a tower. Jaime apologized. Bran only said, "You won't be able to help us in the war if I let them murder you first." Daenerys also learned the truth about Jaime's past. He had killed her father. But Brienne of Tarth defended him, and Sansa listened. Slowly, old enemies became reluctant allies. Then came the most important revelation of all. Sam told Jon the truth. His mother was Lyanna Stark. His father was Rhaegar Targaryen. Sirius, your name isn't Jon Snow, it's Aegon Targaryen, true heir to the Iron Throne. Jon was shaken, not just by his claim, but by what it meant for Daenerys, the woman he loved. As the news sank in, the horn sounded at Winterfell's walls. The army of the dead had arrived. Winterfell stood ready, but barely. The living had gathered from across Westeros, Unsullied, Dothraki, Northmen, Vale Knights, free folk. But the numbers meant little against death. The plan was simple. Draw the Night King to Bran Stark, who waited in the Godswood. He was the bait, the memory of mankind. The battle began in silence and fire. Melisandre returned, lighting the Dothraki's blades. Their charge into darkness was swift and extinguished in seconds. The undead surged forward. Jon and Daenerys flew above on their dragons, burning whites by the thousands. But even dragonfire couldn't stop the cold storm that followed. Inside Winterfell, the dead breached the walls. Brienne, Jaime, Sam, Gendry, Arya, and the Hound fought in the chaos. Grey Worm held the Unsullied line. The crypts, once thought safe, became tombs of terror as the dead rose from within. The Night King arrived, and Jon gave chase. Daenerys tried to burn him, but he stood unharmed in the flames. He raised the dead once more, and Jon was surrounded. In the Godswood, Theon Greyjoy defended Bran to the last. As the Night King approached, Bran whispered, "You're a good man, Theon." Theon charged and died. The Night King moved toward Bran, ready to end the world of men. But from the shadows came Arya Stark. She leapt, silent as death. He caught her by the throat, but she dropped the dagger into her other hand and stabbed him through the heart. The Night King shattered. The army of the dead collapsed. The long night was over. But victory came at a cost. Jorah, Theon, Lyanna Mormont, Beric, Ed, and thousands more lay dead. And winter was not yet done. The dead were gone, but the living still had wars to fight. After the Battle of Winterfell, those who survived burned their dead. Tears were shed, alliances shifted, and a new threat loomed. Queen Cersei, still seated on the Iron Throne. Daenerys had lost much. Jorah, most of her army, and the trust of Westeros. Worse still, Jon's true identity began to spread. Despite promising not to tell, Jon shared the truth with his family. Sansa told Tyrion, Tyrion told Varys, and suddenly the secret wasn't a secret anymore. Varys saw a greater danger in Daenerys. He began plotting to seat Jon on the throne, someone born of fire, but raised with honor. At Dragonstone, tragedy struck again. As Daenerys sailed for King's Landing, Euron Greyjoy ambushed her fleet. Rhaegal, her second dragon, was struck by scorpion bolts and killed mid-flight, crashing into the sea. Missandei, Daenerys' closest friend, was captured and delivered to Cersei. Outside the gates of King's Landing, Daenerys demanded surrender. Cersei refused. Instead, she had Missandei executed in front of everyone. Her final word, determined, Dracarys. Back at Dragonstone, Daenerys unraveled. Grief, betrayal, and isolation consumed her. Tyrion begged her for mercy. Jon tried to calm her, but her eyes burned not just with loss, but vengeance. That night, Varys was executed for treason by dragonfire. The queen who once freed slaves now stood alone, one dragon, one army, and one throne away from taking it all. King's Landing stood on the edge of war. Jon Snow, Davos, Tyrion, and Daenerys prepared for the final assault. Tyrion begged her, "If the city surrenders, if they ring the bells, promise you'll stop." She gave no answer. The battle began with terror from the skies. Daenerys, atop Drogon, annihilated the Iron Fleet, shattered the city's defenses, and opened the gates for her army. The Golden Company, Cersei's last hope, was crushed in moments. Lannister soldiers dropped their swords. Bells rang from every tower. The city had surrendered. But Daenerys didn't stop. Consumed by rage, grief, and a lust for justice twisted into vengeance, she unleashed Drogon on the city. Flames rained down on soldiers, children, mothers. Stone turned to ash. Innocents burned where they stood. Jon watched in horror as the queen he loved destroyed everything he'd sworn to protect. Grey worms slaughtered surrendered soldiers. Arya, trapped in the chaos, tried to save a mother and daughter, but only ash remained. Cersei and Jaime reunited in the Red Keep's crypts. She wept, terrified. He held her. They died together, buried beneath the collapsing castle. The Queen of Ash had claimed her throne, not through peace, but by fire. Tyrion wandered the ruins, stunned. He found his siblings buried together. Their deaths shattered what little loyalty he had left. The people who had once believed in Daenerys now looked at her with fear. The conqueror had won, but at what cost? The ashes of King's Landing still smoldered. Daenerys stood before her army, triumphant, draped in black, flames behind her. She spoke of liberation, not just in Westeros, but everywhere. Tyrion confronted her. He threw away his hand of the queen pin. She had become what she once vowed to destroy. He was arrested. Jon Snow visited Tyrion in his cell. They debated duty, destiny, and love twisted into destruction. "Love is the death of duty," Tyrion said. Jon still believed in Daenerys, until Tyrion reminded him of the future. What if Sansa refused to kneel? Arya? Would Daenerys burn them too? Jon walked through the ruined Red Keep. Snow, or was it ash, fell from the sky. Drogon guarded the steps to the throne. And there she was, Daenerys, alone at last with the Iron Throne. She touched it. She had dreamed of it since childhood. Jon approached. She asked him to join her, to build a new world. He kissed her, and then stabbed her in the heart. Daenerys died in his arms. Drogon felt her loss. In anguish, he melted the Iron Throne with dragon fire, not Jon, and flew away with her body. The Game of Thrones ended not with a coronation, but with ashes and silence. Weeks later, Westeros's remaining leaders met to decide its future. Tyrion proposed a new system, rulers chosen by the lords, not born from blood, and he named Bran the Broken, the boy who had become the memory of the realm, as king. Sansa declared the North would remain free. Arya sailed west, beyond the maps. Brienne became Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. Tyrion became Hand once more. Jon was sent to the Night's Watch, a compromise between justice and mercy. He returned to the Wall, then beyond it, riding with the free folk into the snow-covered wilderness. The wheel was broken. The story was over.